Before we get started with today's show, we want to let you know that Historical Figures will now be released bi-weekly.
Thank you so much for your support.
In the new novel, Murder at Half Moon Gate, you can dive into a world swirling with seduction and intrigue.
Murder at Half Moon Gate by Andrea Penrose is on sale now everywhere books are sold. And look for the first Rexford and Sloane mystery, Murder on Black Swan Lake, now in paperback. More info at AndreaPenrose.com. That's AndreaPenrose.com.
During my lifetime, I have dedicated my life to this struggle of the African people. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons will live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I hope to live for and to see realized. But, my Lord, if it needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
Those are the words of activist and political leader Nelson Mandela from a 1964 speech addressed to a courtroom. He had already been in jail for 2 years and was finally facing trial.
He and his collaborators were facing charges of treason for fighting against apartheid, South Africa's system of racial oppression that lasted for 47 years. Mandela had been fighting for equality since 1948.
And he would spend another 27 years imprisoned for his role in the fight. Hi, I'm Vanessa Richardson.
And I'm Carter Roy.
And you're listening to Historical Figures.
If you want to listen to any previous episodes of Historical Figures, you can find them on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast directory.
And if you like the show, we'd really appreciate a 5-star review.
It seems simple, but it helps us keep the show going. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast and on Twitter at Parcast Network. Don't forget to subscribe because a new episode comes out every Wednesday.
Nelson Mandela was one of the giants of the 20th century, a political leader who became the first black president of South Africa.
He was an icon who, over the span of his long lifetime, fought for peace and social justice and helped break down the system of apartheid. Historians compare his moral leadership and wide appeal to such luminaries as Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi.
But before he became universally admired for his human rights advocacy, he paid a high personal price, including spending decades in prison.
In fact, his greatest achievement may have been his ability to forgive not only the architects of the apartheid system, but his own jailers.
Mandela himself reminded us that he was a human being, saying, quote, "I am not a saint, unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying."
And he set up his own yardstick to measure his life. Mandela said, quote, "Do not judge me by my successes. Judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again."
When Nelson Mandela died, James A. Joseph, who served as the U.S. ambassador to South Africa during Mandela's presidency, put it best. Nelson Mandela will, quote, "be remembered not just for the power of his personal story or the strength of his ideals, though those are both worth remembering. Perhaps most important, he taught us about the potential of the human spirit." Mandela was born on July 18, 1918, in Mvezo, South Africa. South Africa was a mix of many different tribes and ethnicities. In previous centuries, the country had been colonized, first by the Dutch and then by the British. At this time, it was under British rule.
Mandela was born into the Madiba clan, a division of the Tembu people. Madiba gets its name from a Tembu chief who ruled in the 18th century. All members of the clan can be called Madiba as a sign of affection and respect. Indeed, Mandela was often called Madiba by his friends and supporters. But when Mandela was born, his father named him Kolikhlahla, which in Xhosa, the language of the Tembu, means troublemaker.
In the Xhosa language, there are 18 different click sounds to master, and since we're not experts in the language, we'll be anglicizing those clicks to a K in this episode. Moving forward, we'll do our best to pronounce the native Xhosa words as accurately as possible. Rolihlahla's father, Gadla Henry Mpakaniswa Mandela, was a local chief of the Tembu people and a counselor to the Tembu's acting king. This effectively made him a member of the Tembu royal family.
Henry Gadla practiced polygamy and had 4 different wives and 13 children. Rolihlahla's mother, Nosekeni, was Henry Gadla's 3rd wife and bore 4 of his children, Rolihlahla and 3 daughters. All told, he had 3 full sisters, 3 half-brothers, and 6 half-sisters.
Growing up, young Rolihlahla heard the tribe's elders tell tales of their resistance fighting against British colonists before he was born. Ultimately, the wars were unsuccessful, and they lost their independence. Rolihlahla hoped that one day he could resume the fight and contribute to the freedom of his people.
But for now, he was just a boy, and many of his early years were spent herding cattle and stick fighting with the other boys his age.
Rolihlahla also learned how to milk a cow, how to catch fish with twine and sharpened bits of wire, and how to knock birds out of the sky with a slingshot.
Writing in his autobiography much later, he said these early years gave him an appreciation and love for nature and for open spaces and wide flowing fields.
Though both his parents were illiterate, they realized the importance of an education. It was a theme that he later echoed himself, saying, quote, "Education is the most powerful weapon in which you can use to change the world."
At the age of 7, around 1921, he began his British schooling, going to a local Methodist school in Kunu. It was here that his teacher gave him the name Nelson, because she thought all the children should have good Christian names.
Later, Mandela could not recall why the teacher chose Nelson or what his reaction to the new name was. Probably indifference, because he accepted the name and moved forward.
In 1930, when Mandela was 12 years old, his father died. He, his mother, and his sisters moved in with an uncle, a chief in the Tembu tribe. Because of his uncle's standing, Mandela was able to sit in on council meetings where decisions were reached by consensus. Mandela later credited that with teaching him democratic values.
He studied English, history, geography, and the Xhosa language at his local school. He also attended church services every Sunday, and Christianity became a significant part of his life.
The teenage Nelson Mandela also developed a love for African history and traditions. When he was 16 years old, he traveled with other boys to the banks of the Mbashi River to undergo the ritual circumcision that marked their transition from boys into men.
He attended Clarkbury Methodist High School in Nkobo, the largest school for Black Africans in Tembuland. Tembuland was the traditional region for the Tembu people in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa.
The school was an adjustment for Mandela. He had been treated with deference in his tribe because he was part of the chief's family. But here, there were many boys with distinguished lineages. He quickly realized what was important was ability, not heritage. Since many of his classmates could outrun him on the field and outthink him in the classroom, he worked hard to catch up.
While he was in school, his favorite sports were boxing and cross-country running.
If you're looking for metaphors, they're easy to find. As a trained boxer, he learned to fight. And as for cross-country, he developed the endurance that would keep him running for the finish line.
Set to become a chief like his uncle and his father, Mandela decided to pursue a different path. He began to study law at the South African Native College at Fort Hare, matriculating in 1939 at the age of 21.
It was at Fort Hare that he first learned of the African National Congress, a group formed in 1912 to peacefully reclaim land stolen by whites. Though Mandela had friends in the organization, he did not become a member at this time.
It was also at the university that he met Oliver Tambo. Mandela later said, quote, "I like friends who have independent minds because they tend to make you see problems from all angles," end quote. In Tambo, Mandela found this kind of friend.
Tambo became a lifelong friend and ally in the struggle for equality in South Africa, but they started small. With the Student Council, Mandela and Tambo joined forces to organize a boycott to get better food for the students at the college.
The university was not so understanding of Mandela's activist impulses. He was suspended and left school.
At the same time, Mandela's uncle told him that he had found a bride for his nephew.
Mandela did not want to be tied down to a woman he had not chosen himself. In 1941, at the age of 22, Nelson Mandela ran off to Johannesburg to escape the arranged marriage.
This was an eye-opening experience for Mandela.
As an essentially anonymous black man in the city, he got to see firsthand what it was like for oppressed black South Africans.
Black South Africans in Johannesburg were paid a pittance, and they lived in squalor. Mandela saw up close the poverty, the crime, and the pollution.
In April of 1941, Mandela secured work as a guard in a mine.
South Africa was a country rich in natural resources, including gold and diamonds. And the mines throughout the nation were staffed by impoverished black South Africans who did the dangerous and backbreaking work.
Fairly quickly, Mandela moved on to work as a clerk in a law firm. He also continued his education, and in 1943, the year he turned 25, he earned his BA degree through a correspondence course at the University of South Africa.
In the evenings, Mandela continued pursuing his passion for boxing. He was an amateur heavyweight, tall and broad-shouldered. He admired Joe Louis, the American boxer who reigned as world champ from 1937 to 1949, and is recognized as one of the greatest heavyweight boxers of all time.
Mandela said he loved the sport's egalitarian nature. When it was two men in the ring, they were equal. Color, class, and wealth meant nothing. What mattered was what they brought to the fight with their heart and their skills.
At the law firm where he worked, Mandela met Gore Radebe, a COSA member of both the African National Congress and the Communist Party. He also met Nat Bregman, a Jewish communist who became his first white friend.
With these men, Mandela attended meetings of the Communist Party. He admired how the communists brought together people from all different backgrounds, but he did not join the party because its atheism conflicted with his Christian faith.
In 1942, Nelson Mandela finally joined the African National Congress, the ANC. 2 years later, he and other young ANC leaders founded a subgroup called the Congress Youth League, which stressed nonviolent protest.
At the same time he was working on these causes, Mandela became involved with Evelyn Ntoko Mase, a trainee nurse and activist he met at an ANC meeting. Like Mandela, she was a devout Christian whose father had died when she was very young.
Evelyn was smitten with Mandela, and she later confessed, quote, "I think I loved him the first time I saw him." In October of 1944, Evelyn and Mandela got married. They had their first child in February of 1945, a boy named Tembakile, Tembi for short.
Their first daughter, Makaziwe, died of meningitis in 1947 when she was only 9 months old.
Family was important to Nelson Mandela, but he was increasingly driven by his activism. Evelyn was upset that he spent so much time away.
But Mandela's activism was more of a necessity than ever after the election of 1948. On May 26, 1948, the Conservative National Party became the governing party in South Africa, and they instituted the policy of apartheid.
Apartheid, which means separateness in Afrikaans, was the official practice of formalized racial segregation. Under apartheid, every person in South Africa had to be classified according to their racial group.
These classifications were legally defined as black, white, and colored or of mixed heritage. Later, the government added Indian as a classification, as there was a large population of people of South Asian descent in South Africa.
This classification determined where a person could be born, where they could live, where they could go to school, where they could work, where they could be treated if they were sick, and even where they could be buried when they died.
White people, who were now the only ones allowed to vote, had the best opportunities and the most money spent on their facilities. Meanwhile, black South Africans, whose lives were strictly controlled, primarily lived in poverty.
In the aftermath of World War II, where the world had defeated the Nazis, this was a dramatic step backward. In essence, the ruling whites of the country of South Africa were declaring themselves the master race.
Obviously, Nelson Mandela opposed the system of apartheid, but his vision was broader. His ultimate goal was the eradication of racism. He also yearned for the establishment of a constitutional democracy with the fundamental underpinning of one person, one vote.
The resistance took many forms in those days. Mandela and the ANC held a national day of protest against the classification laws on June 26, 1950.
Coincidentally, Mandela's second son, Makhato, was born that same day.
In 1952, Mandela launched the Defiance Campaign, which encouraged South Africans, both black and white, to intentionally break the laws of apartheid. Hundreds of thousands of black men and women took part.
They entered the white-only sections of post offices and railway stations. They also burned their passbooks, which listed where they could travel and when they could leave their homes.
Over 8,500 people were jailed during the year-long campaign, including Mandela.
Mandela was not charged and was released quickly, but it didn't take long before Mandela's defiance landed him in more trouble.
Time for a message we want you to hear.
We are passionate about telling the stories of history's biggest icons and sharing the little-known facts with all of you.
We want to dedicate more research and time to each episode, which is why we have decided to start releasing new episodes of historical figures every other week.
With this extra week between episodes, we'll be able to dive deeper into our research and produce the best podcast we possibly can for you.
Additionally, we would love to have more support for the show, so please tell your friends and family to check out Historical Figures. With more support, we'd happily return to releasing new episodes weekly.
Thank you for your endless support of our show. We greatly appreciate our listeners.
Now, let's get back to the story. On July 30th, 1952, just weeks after he turned 34, Nelson Mandela was arrested and sent to trial for the first time. He and 19 others stood trial and were convicted in December of statutory communism.
You did not have to be a communist to be convicted of statutory communism. It was a charge the government used against people who opposed the apartheid regime.
Mandela and his fellow defendants were sentenced to 9 months in prison with hard labor, but the sentence was suspended for 5 years.
Although Mandela technically never attained a law degree because he failed his final exams at the college, he obtained work as an attorney and in 1952 passed his qualifying exam.
In 1953, Mandela and his friend Oliver Tambo opened a law firm in Johannesburg. It was the first black law firm in South Africa.
As a lawyer of aristocratic heritage, Mandela was now part of the city's elite black middle class and was treated with respect in the black community.
But he had problems at home.
Mandela has said he was no saint, and this was one time he proved it. He became involved with other women, and there are rumors he even fathered a child with a secretary at the ANC.
Evelyn accused Mandela of adultery and initiated divorce proceedings in 1956.
Through the turmoil at home, Mandela continued his activism, and the government responded by escalating the fight.
In March of 1956, Mandela received his third ban on public appearances, which restricted him to Johannesburg, but he openly defied it.
On December 5, 1956, Mandela was arrested for general high treason with scores of others, including most of the ANC leadership.
Mandela and the group were released on bail about 2 weeks later, but the trial for treason went on and on. In fact, the trial ended up lasting 4.5 years.
While the trial was going on, life continued. Mandela began courting Nomzamo Winifred Zanyiwe Madikizela, known as Winnie.
Winnie was the daughter of 2 teachers. After her mother's death, she and her siblings were all sent off to live with relatives, but Winnie thrived and became head girl at her school, and she was a pioneer in her own right. She was the first black social worker in South Africa.
Nelson Mandela's divorce was finalized in March of 1958, and his ex-wife Evelyn was awarded care of the children. Just 3 months later, on June 14, 1958, Mandela married Winnie. At the time, he was 39 and she was just 21.
They had their first daughter, Zenani, in February of 1959, and a second daughter, Zinziswa, in December of 1960.
As in the American battle for civil rights, which was happening around the same time, there was a divide in the ranks between those who advocated nonviolent resistance and those who favored a more militant approach.
Nelson Mandela was one who supported nonviolence, but that was to change on March 21, 1960, at Sharpeville.
At Sharpeville, thousands of black South Africans demonstrated against the pass laws, and they converged on the police station to give back their pass books.
Though the crowd was unarmed, the police opened fire. Soon the demonstrators were running for their lives. Still, the police continued their assault.
69 were killed. Many of them were women and children, and most of the dead were shot in the back.
Although the Sharpeville massacre was met with national and international condemnation, the government responded by cracking down even more. They declared a national state of emergency and outlawed the African National Congress and other groups like it.
It was at this point that Nelson Mandela realized peaceful resistance was futile. It was time for armed struggle.
Later, Mandela recounted in his autobiography, quote, "I, who had never been a soldier, who had never fought in a battle, who had never fired a gun at an enemy, had been given the task of starting an army."
In the middle of this tense time, Mandela and Winnie still found reason to celebrate.
This is when they welcomed their second daughter, Zinziswa, into the world in December of 1960.
In 1961, Nelson Mandela helped form Umkhonto weSizwe, which means the Spear of the Nation, also known as MK. The Army of Freedom Fighters was the armed wing of the African National Congress. Mandela, by this point, was incredibly respected and recognized as a leader of the movement, and was named MK's commander-in-chief.
At the same time, Mandela went underground. He was now an enemy of the state and branded by the government as a wanted terrorist.
He left the country for military training and to gather support for the armed struggle, which meant finding money and weapons.
Mandela traveled across Africa in disguise.
He also learned how to make bombs. He did not want to endanger lives, only property. The goal was to sabotage government installations such as power plants, phone lines, and transport stations late at night when no civilians were present.
In May of 1961, Nelson Mandela gave his first ever TV interview to ITV. He said, "There is room for all the various races in this country."
He wanted the government to know that his men were armed freedom fighters, not terrorists, that their goal was democracy, majority rule, where everyone could vote. They wanted to live in peace and harmony with equal rights for all people.
In June of 1961, Mandela addressed a letter to Hendrik Verwoerd, Prime Minister of South Africa. He warned that if the government did not hold a national constitutional convention, he would launch a new campaign of resistance.
He knew the government would not respond, and so the first attack was an act of sabotage against an electrical substation.
The campaign continued, and they hit other targets as well. Nelson Mandela remained a fugitive for over a year. He was arrested about 2 weeks after returning to South Africa, when he was stopped at a police roadblock on August 5, 1962, near Soweto, a town not far from Johannesburg. Mandela was charged with leaving the country without a passport and inciting workers to strike.
He was convicted on November 7, 1962, and sentenced to 5 years in prison.
In July of 1963, police raided Lily's Leaf Farm in Rivonia, a secret safe house used by the African National Congress. There, they found papers documenting MK's activities, including some which mentioned Mandela.
It was a moment of reckoning for Mandela. one in which he came to realize that, quote, real leaders must be ready to sacrifice all for the freedom of their people.
On October 9th, 1963, Nelson Mandela was brought to stand trial for sabotage in what became known as the Rivonia Trial.
Mandela used the trial to condemn apartheid. In an eloquent 4-hour speech before the court, he spoke of the plight of black South Africans and the crimes committed by the government.
If convicted, Mandela faced the possibility of being hanged, which he did not shy away from when he spoke to the court. He concluded his speech by saying, quote, I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal for which I hope to live and achieve, but, if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
The defendants were found guilty on all charges. The good news, if it could be called that, was that they were spared the death penalty.
The judge did not want to make them martyrs, so when he sentenced them on June 12, 1964, he gave them life in prison.
The prison that Mandela was sent to was Robben Island, the Alcatraz of South Africa.
In terms of geography, Robben Island is an island in Table Bay off the west coast of South Africa. It is flat and only a few feet above sea level.
But since the late 17th century, it had been used for the isolation of political prisoners.
On June 13, 1964, Nelson Mandela, then 45 years old, arrived to spend the rest of his life behind bars.
Nelson Mandela's new home, prison cell number 5, was 8 feet by 7 feet. An iron bucket served as his toilet. There was a thin blanket on the floor that served as his bed.
Even in prison, Mandela could not escape the class system. Each prisoner was assigned to a privilege group A through D. This was decided at the sole discretion of the Commissioner of Prisons. He classified Mandela as a D-class prisoner, the lowest of the low. For the first few years, Mandela could wear nothing but shorts.
His prison number was 46664 because he was the 466th inmate to arrive in the year 64. It was a number he would never forget.
Time moved slowly in the prison. He wrote that every hour in captivity felt like a year.
Later, he confessed that he, quote, found himself on the verge of initiating conversations with a cockroach.
While a prisoner, Mandela encountered physical hardships. He was put to work at hard labor, breaking limestone rocks with a hammer.
The glare off the white limestone ruined his eyes. That's why in later years he usually wore glasses.
He also dealt with the mental hardships common in prison life. One wonders if, during the many hours of loneliness and isolation in his cell, Mandela came up with one of his more famous quotes. It always seems impossible until it's done.
His cross-country background came in handy. He ran up to 7 miles a day, sometimes in place in his cell, and sometimes in the prison courtyard, and he shadowboxed to keep his reflexes sharp.
He could only send letters twice a year, and he only got letters back twice a year as well.
It was worse than that. The letters Mandela received back had been heavily censored. With so many lines cut out, the papers looked like Swiss cheese.
The time in prison was not only hard on Mandela, but on his family as well.
His wife, Winnie, was allowed limited non-contact visits. But since visitors had to be at least 16 years old to visit the prison, Mandela could not see his 2 daughters.
Mandela's mother died in 1968, and he was not allowed to attend the funeral.
More tragedy followed. In 1969, his son Tembi from his first marriage, who was only 24 years old, died in a car accident. Mandela was informed by a telegram given to him in prison 3 days after the crash.
The telegram merely stated that his son had died in a car crash, but it gave no further details.
And as with his mother's death, Mandela was not allowed to attend his son's funeral. He wasn't even told where his son was buried.
And then there was the pressure that the apartheid government applied on Winnie Mandela. She was kept under house arrest and surveillance for her ties to the resistance movement and the ANC. In 1969, she was brought to Pretoria Central Prison and spent 491 days in solitary confinement, Her daughters, 10 and 8, begged her not to leave them.
All of this served to strengthen Nelson Mandela's mental toughness. Later he wrote, quote, "I learned that courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear."
Mandela always held out hope for the future, noting, quote, "Difficulties break some men, but make others. No axe is sharp enough to cut the soul of a sinner who keeps on trying, one armed with the hope that he will rise even in the end."
Mandela made the best of his time behind bars. While he was in prison, Mandela worked on passages that would become part of his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom. They were smuggled out by ANC collaborators who were moved or released before Mandela himself was freed.
He learned to speak Afrikaans, one of the languages spoken by and associated with the white South Africans, so he could understand and communicate with his oppressors better. He said, quote, "When you speak to a man and he understands, he does so with his mind. But if you speak to him in his language, he understands with his heart."
And so he became friends with many guards and prison wardens this way.
Outside of the members in prison, the ANC's activism continued, as did the bloodshed. On June 16, 1976, police fired on a crowd of school children protesting the education system in Soweto. The official count of the dead was 176, but others have suggested it may have been over 700.
This ignited a 2-year uprising that left more than 1,000 people dead and thousands more imprisoned.
Mandela was able to smuggle a message out of Robben Island in 1980. He paid tribute to the dead as martyrs and encouraged his countrymen to continue the fight.
He noted that the international community was becoming aware of the situation, writing, quote, "The revulsion of the world against apartheid is growing. Every effort to isolate South Africa adds strength to our struggle." End quote. He was right. Free Mandela had become an international cry.
In 1982, after 18 long years at Robben Island, Mandela was transferred to Pollsmoor Prison in Cape Town.
Although he was able to leave the island alive, it was hardly a cause for celebration. The government was moving Mandela to keep him away from the other Robben Island prisoners. They also wanted to isolate him at his new prison. Mandela spent the next 6 years in almost total solitary confinement.
This did not stop the international groundswell as country after country started imposing economic sanctions on South Africa to protest the system of apartheid. These included South Africa's biggest trading partners, Japan, the United States, and countries in Europe.
There was also a personal triumph for Mandela. He was finally allowed a contact visit. He hadn't touched his wife Winnie in 21 years, until she was finally allowed to hug him on a prison visit in 1985.
As the 1980s progressed, the legend of Nelson Mandela only grew. Sympathetic governments named streets and public squares after him. Colleges granted him honorary degrees, in absentia, of course.
There was even a song, Free Nelson Mandela, performed by the Specials, which became an international hit.
Mandela's importance as a symbol was a concern to the South African government, as they did not want the international community to turn against them. So President P.W. Botha, a hardliner elected in 1978, offered Mandela his release in 1985. However, it was only on the condition that the African National Congress renounce all violence.
Mandela rejected the conditional release, saying, quote, "I am not prepared to sell the birthright of the people to be free."
Winnie continued her activism, sometimes siding more with the militants in the movement than she did with Mandela. In 1986, Winnie gave a speech that condoned the practice of necklacing. This was a form of torture and execution, where a rubber tire was forced around a victim's chest and arms, filled with gasoline and set on fire.
Winnie said, quote, "With our boxes of matches and our necklaces, we shall liberate this country."
Winnie was also accused of wrongdoing through the Mandela United Football Club, which acted as her personal security detail. In 1988, the club kidnapped 4 young men from a Methodist minister's home. Winnie said it was because she suspected they were being sexually abused by the minister, but a witness claimed that the boys were tortured by Winnie and the football club, and one boy who was suspected of being an informant was later found stabbed to death. Stricken with tuberculosis in 1988, Mandela was transferred to Victor Verster prison. He was also moved from his cell to a small house on the prison grounds.
A year later, in 1989, the moderate F.W. de Klerk took over as the president of South Africa. Negotiations began in earnest for the conditions of Mandela's release.
Mandela demanded that all other political prisoners be freed, and the state of emergency that gave police sweeping powers be lifted.
It was a lot to ask for, but Mandela had not come this far to accept anything less. De Klerk relented.
On February 11, 1990, after 27 years in prison, Nelson Mandela was unconditionally released.
Mandela was 71 years old, his hair gone gray, his body thin. But the former heavyweight boxer walked out of the prison gate and pumped his right fist in the air. The thousands of people who gathered to watch roared their approval.
Mandela addressed the crowd. He said, "Friends, comrades, and fellow South Africans, I stand before you not as a prophet, but as a humble servant of you, the people."
Certainly it was a triumphant moment, but there was still much work to do.
Mandela embarked on a 13-nation tour to push for continued sanctions against South Africa. In Manhattan, he received a ticker-tape parade. In Washington, D.C., he spoke to a joint session of Congress.
But even as he pushed to change South Africa, Mandela reached out to all races and stressed the importance of peace. The country was on the brink of civil war, and according to many observers, it was only through the power of Nelson Mandela that the whole place didn't blow.
Mandela spoke clearly and forcefully. Quote, "For to be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others."
He also stressed that revenge was not what was driving him. He said, quote, "Resentment is like drinking poison and then hoping it will kill your enemies."
He had to walk a delicate path. He still opposed apartheid, but he rejected the harshest revenge rhetoric of his allies.
The message was not necessarily popular in all quarters. In fact, it caused friction in his own house. In 1991, Winnie was acquitted of all her crimes during Mandela's time in prison, with the exception of the kidnapping charge. Her 6-year sentence was reduced to a fine on appeal.
In 1992, Winnie was also accused of ordering the murder of a family friend. She allegedly paid an intermediary the equivalent of $8,000 and gave him the gun used in the killing.
Winnie denied the accusation, and publicly, Mandela stood by her.
Privately, however, friends of Mandela were telling him that he had to distance himself from Winnie.
It's not clear exactly how Mandela felt about the accusations. He seemed to have settled on a position that Winnie may have been aware of things happening, but she was not ultimately responsible.
Beyond the political issues, Nelson and Winnie Mandela were having problems in their relationship.
Mandela put the blame on himself. He wrote that Winnie, quote, "married a man who soon left her. That man became a myth. And then that myth returned home and proved to be just a man after all."
It was not long before Mandela and Winnie were living separate lives. By 1992, they were living apart, and their marriage was effectively over.
In public life, Nelson Mandela continued his push for democracy and freedom. Thanks to his hard work, in 1993, South Africa agreed upon and adopted a new interim constitution. This constitution abolished apartheid, restructured the government, and established a Bill of Rights. It also set a process in place to write a final constitution.
Those efforts were recognized by the international community. In October of 1993, it was announced that Nelson Mandela and President of South Africa, F.W. de Klerk, had won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Though some questioned why de Klerk was sharing the prize, Mandela, as always, was magnanimous. He said, quote, "Whatever mistakes de Klerk has made, and he has made many, he has his place in history. Without his support, we would never have made peace.
Mandela accepted the Peace Prize in December of 1993, but an even bigger triumph came 4 months later.
In April of 1994, South Africa held the first election in its 84-year history where black, colored, and Indian people could vote. Nelson Mandela, now 75 years old, voted for the very first time.
The African National Congress won in a landslide, with 62% of the vote. This made Mandela, as the leader of the party, the president.
Tens of thousands gathered for his inauguration on May 10, 1994. He told the crowd, quote, "Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another and suffer the indignity of being the skunk of the world. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement."
Being president did not stop his humanitarian work. In 1995, he started the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund, an organization whose mission was to help individuals from birth to age 22, particularly orphans of the AIDS crisis. And each month, Mandela donated 1/3 of his salary to the charity.
Of course, Mandela's presidency did not solve all the problems of the country. Crime soared, unemployment remained high, and government programs to expand housing moved more slowly than some would have liked.
Still, he held the country together, and that in itself was a momentous achievement. It is why a historian once described Nelson Mandela as the father of a nation. George Washington and Abraham Lincoln rolled into one.
Part of the healing process was the 1996 establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The commission was a court-like tribunal in which victims of human rights abuses could make witness statements on the record, and in which perpetrators could request amnesty.
This was certainly controversial. Unlike the Nuremberg trials after World War II, where Nazis were punished for their crimes, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission focused on restoration rather than retribution.
Still, despite its flaws, it's generally considered to have been successful.
But Mandela may have been embarrassed when the commission examined Winnie, even though they had divorced earlier in 1996. Its final report found Winnie Mandela politically and morally accountable for the gross violation of human rights committed by the Mandela United Football Club.
After his and Winnie's divorce, Mandela got one more shot at happiness. On his 80th birthday, July 18, 1998, Nelson Mandela married his third wife, Graça Machel.
She was the widow of Mozambique's former president, and her relationship with Mandela lasted for the rest of his life.
Mandela's personal life certainly had its ups and downs, and the toll that his struggle put on his family was his biggest regret. Still, when it came time to reflect, he was pragmatic in putting it in perspective. Mandela said, quote, "If I had my time over, I would do the same again. So would any man who dares call himself a man."
One of his biggest victories came in 1997, when South Africa ratified a new constitution.
It's said by historians that the most important election in a republic is the second election, because the second election establishes that there will be regular elections and that there will be a peaceful transfer of power.
Perhaps with that in mind, Nelson Mandela served only one 5-year term and stepped down in 1999. It established succession and allowed the country to move on.
Thabo Mbeki succeeded Nelson Mandela and became the second post-apartheid president of South Africa. Not coincidentally, Mbeki was also the second black president of South Africa.
But Mandela's work was not done. Although he was stepping back from the spotlight, and he said he hoped to revel in obscurity, he was in too much demand to exit the stage completely.
He continued to be a global advocate for human rights and showed up for functions around the globe in his bright, colorful African shirts.
His message was consistently one of tolerance and love. He said, quote, "Nobody is born hating others because of their color, religion, or background. People must be taught to hate, and if they can be taught to hate, then they can learn to love, because love comes more naturally to the human heart than its opposite."
One of his most personal missions was to raise awareness about AIDS, a disease that afflicted 1 in 9 South Africans.
This had personal resonance for Mandela. because his only surviving son, Mahato Luanika, had the disease.
Another sign of how important the issue was is that Mandela named his AIDS charity 46664 after his old prison number.
There were other causes for Mandela to support as well, from poverty to education to the horrific violence in Sudan's war-torn Darfur region.
And Mandela was not afraid of getting involved in politics, whether it was working as a mediator in Burundi's civil war, persuading Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi to surrender the men responsible for the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland, or calling out the Bush administration in late 2002 as it sought to build a case for invading Iraq.
He claimed Vice President Dick Cheney and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld were dinosaurs who were misleading President Bush, and he told Newsweek magazine, quote, "What I condemn is one power with a president who can't think properly and who wants to plunge the world into Holocaust."
Although he was still a powerful voice, physically, Nelson Mandela was slowing down.
In 2004, at the age of 86, he was treated for prostate cancer. Then he announced he was retiring from public life.
He made one final trip to the United States in 2005, but recognized it would probably be his last. He said, quote, "People our age should not be traveling across oceans."
That same year, Mandela announced publicly that his son Makato had died of an AIDS-related illness.
On Mandela's 90th birthday in July of 2008, there were celebrations across South Africa. Mandela gave a speech urging the wealthy of the nation to do more to help the poor.
Mandela spent his final years at his homes in Johannesburg and in the village of Kunu, in rural southeastern South Africa, not far from where he herded sheep as a boy.
On December 5th, 2013, at the age of 95, Nelson Mandela died. The cause of death was a lung infection, a remnant of the tuberculosis he caught in prison.
When Mandela died, the president of South Africa, Jacob Zuma, put it succinctly, quote, "Our nation has lost its greatest son. Our people have lost their father."
Barack Obama, then the President of the United States, echoed the sentiment, saying Mandela, quote, "achieved more than could be expected of any man. Today he has gone home, and we have lost one of the most influential, courageous, and profoundly good human beings that any of us will share time with on this earth. He no longer belongs to us. He belongs to the ages."
Mandela was given a state funeral and buried in the village where he grew up.
He was survived by his third wife, Graça Michel, his second wife, Winnie, 3 daughters, 17 grandchildren, and 13 great-grandchildren.
Though he passed only 5 years ago, the legacy of Nelson Mandela lives on. There have been numerous books and documentaries about his life.
There have also been many films. Mandela has been portrayed by such decorated actors as Danny Glover in Mandela, Dennis Haysbert in Goodbye Batana, Terrence Howard in Winnie Mandela, Morgan Freeman in Invictus, and Idris Elba in Mandela, Long Walk to Freedom.
But the real significance of Nelson Mandela lies not with the movie stars who tried to capture the essence of the great man on screen, but in the simple power of his message.
So it's only fitting that we remember Mandela by the words he spoke. Quote, "Everyone can rise above their circumstances and achieve success if they are dedicated to and passionate about what they do.
A good head and a good heart are always a formidable combination.
There is no passion to be found playing small, in settling for a life that is less than the one you are capable of living.
The greatest glory in living lies not in never falling, but in rising every time we fall."
And as we let our own light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Historical Figures.
A new episode comes out every Wednesday, so don't forget to subscribe to Historical Figures on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, Spotify, or your favorite podcast directory. And While you're there, leave us a 5-star review.
You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at Parcast, and on Twitter at Parcast Network, or through our website, parcast.com. That's PARCAST.com.
As always, we thank you for listening.
Historical Figures was created by Max Cutler. It is a production of Cutler Media and is part of the Parcast Network. It is produced by Max and Ron Cutler, sound designed by Russell Nash, with production assistance by Ron Shapiro and Paul Mahler. Additional production assistance by Maggie Admire and Carly Madden. Historical Figures is written by Stephen DeLello and stars Vanessa Richardson and Carter Roy.